Have you ever paused to truly wonder what war is? Beyond the dramatic headlines, the chaotic images we see,
Yeah.
or just the clash of armies?
Yeah.
Is it merely brute force, or is there something far deeper at play? Maybe an intricate logic governing its very nature?
It's a really profound question, actually. And for much of history, even those who waged war often operated without a fully coherent understanding of its fundamental principles.
Hmm.
Today, we're going to peel back those layers and explore some truly foundational insights that might reshape how you think about conflict.
Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. This is where we take your sources, your articles, your research, maybe even your own notes, and we uncover the essential nuggets of knowledge. We want to help you become truly well-informed and quickly.
Exactly.
For this particular deep dive, we're embarking on what I think is a fascinating journey into the very nature of conflict, and we're guided by some profound excerpts from a classic text on the theory of war.
That's right. And our mission today really is to unpack these powerful, often quite philosophical ideas.
Yeah, they can be dense.
They can be, but we want to make them completely accessible, even if you've never really delved into military theory before. We'll break down the complex concepts, offer clear step-by-step definitions.
And connect them to real-world understanding. We want to ensure that by the end of our conversation, you'll walk away feeling genuinely informed about a topic that, let's face it, influences so much of our global landscape.
Absolutely.
And as your guide through this intellectual terrain, I'll be here to set the stage, highlight those surprising facts that jump out, and make sure everything we discuss feels relatable. I'm really eager to explore these ideas with you.
And I'll be focusing on synthesizing the information, connecting the dots between concepts that might seem separate at first glance, and hopefully encouraging you to think a bit deeper, providing that crucial why it matters behind these core principles.
So get ready for an aha moment or two, hopefully.
Hopefully. And a fresh, insightful perspective on a topic that has shaped and continues to shape our world.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the very beginning, because the opening lines of our source material, they really lay down a fundamental truth about war, something many of us might just overlook. It states, war is an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. So right there, it tells us war isn't just random fighting or chaos.
No.
It has a very specific purpose to make someone do what you want them to do. It's an act of coercion.
That's it, exactly. It's not about violence for its own sake, right? The text clarifies that physical force, the act of violence, is merely the means to an end.
The tool.
The tool, precisely. The ultimate object is the compulsory submission of the enemy to our will. And to achieve that fully, at least in theory, the enemy must be disarmed.
Disarmed, okay.
That act of disarmament, completely neutralizing their ability to resist, that becomes the real aim of hostilities in theory because it directly enables that ultimate political object of forcing their will. It's a battlefield objective, sure, but it serves the larger strategic goal.
Okay, so it's not just about winning a single battle,
Yeah.
but about taking away their very capacity to fight back, which then leaves them essentially no choice but to comply with your will.
Right.
To really visualize this idea, this compelling will thing, think of it like a really intense game of tug of war.
Okay.
The rope represents the conflict itself, that back and forth struggle. But your goal isn't just to pull the rope. Your goal is to pull the other side over the line. That specific act, pulling them over, that's compelling their will.
I like that.
And if you imagine disarming them in this analogy, it's like taking the rope right out of their hands. They physically can't pull back anymore. You've achieved your aim. You've imposed your will.
That's a powerful and really clear way to visualize it. Now, the source also introduces a crucial distinction for understanding conflict. It talks about the two different elements in a fight, the hostile feeling and the hostile view.
What exactly is the difference there? Because, for someone new to this, feeling and view might sound pretty similar, maybe like two sides of the same coin.
They are indeed related, definitely, but they're distinct in a really crucial way. Hostile feeling refers to the raw emotion, the passion, the hatred, the animosity that can, at its most intense, border on pure instinct. Think of it as the emotional fuel, maybe.
Okay, the fire.
The fire, exactly. Hostile view, on the other hand, is about the intention, the understanding, the strategic purpose behind the action. It's the cognitive element, the thinking part. And the text states that it chose the hostile view as the characteristic of war because it's the most general.
And why is the view considered more general Or maybe more consistently important than the feeling.
Because it's a constant, the source explains that while you can't really imagine intense hatred existing without some kind of hostile intention driving it, right?
Right.
You can absolutely have hostile intentions without being consumed by extreme hostile feelings. For instance, a nation might decide to go to war purely for, say, economic gain, or to secure strategic resources, or maybe to prevent a future threat. They might do that without burning with passionate hatred for the enemy population itself. The intention, that calculated goal, is always present, even if the raw emotion isn't, at its absolute peak.
That distinction really crystallizes it for me. It's like a professional chess player intends to win, right? They'll execute a precise strategy to achieve checkmate, but they don't necessarily hate their opponent sitting across the board. They just want to achieve their objective. So for you, the key insight here is that when you analyze any conflict, don't just get sidetracked by the visible emotional heat, the passion.
Right.
Always look for that underlying, maybe colder, calculating intention. That seems to be the constant, the true engine of decision-making, even when passions are running incredibly high.
Precisely. Now, the source, it was written in a different era, obviously, and it makes an observation using the terms savages and civilized nations. It suggests that among savages' views emanating from the feelings, amongst civilized nations, those emanating from the understanding, have the predominance.
Okay, that language sounds a bit dated.
It is, definitely. And it's important to understand that this is a historical framing from the source's time, reflecting a particular, maybe hierarchical view of cultural development back then. It's not a modern anthropological judgment.
Right. Context is key.
Absolutely. What the author is really driving at here is that distinction between conflicts predominantly fueled by raw instinctual emotion versus those where a calculated strategic intention takes precedence, regardless of the society involved. But the text very quickly adds that this isn't an absolute division. Even the most civilized nations may burn with passionate hatred of each other.
Okay, that helps put the language into context. So even if there's a lot of passion and emotion swirling around, it's the underlying strategic intent, the view, that truly defines and directs the conflict. That's the consistent element we should always be looking for.
Exactly, the constant thread.
Okay, now we arrive at what is arguably the most famous and profoundly impactful line from this classic text. It's a concept that completely redefines how we understand conflict for many people.
The big one.
War is a mere continuation of policy by other means. This completely flips the script for a lot of folks, right? Who might instinctively see war as a breakdown of policy or something totally separate, a force of its own.
Indeed. This idea is absolutely central to the entire work and, frankly, to modern strategic thought. Let's break down what policy means in this context, because that's key.
Yeah, what is policy here?
It refers to the overall goals, the long-term objectives, and the strategic decisions of a government or a state. It's the grand plan, if you will, that a nation pursues in its domestic and international affairs. War, then, is not some independent entity that just suddenly erupts and takes over everything.
No.
Instead, it's explicitly defined as a tool, an instrument used in service of that larger policy.
So it's not this uncontrollable explosion that just runs wild, completely divorced from political aims.
Precisely. The text argues that if war were a perfect, unrestrained, and absolute expression of force, then yes, it would step into policy's place. It would become entirely independent, just following its own destructive laws.
But that's not how it works in reality.
But the source states this is radically false when you actually look at the reality of war. War, in the real world, is described as the operation of powers which do not develop themselves completely.
What does that mean exactly? Not develop themselves completely.
It means war isn't a single, instantaneous, all-consuming discharge of force. It's more like a pulsation of violent force, more or less vehement, like waves, maybe.
Okay.
And this pulsation lasts long enough to admit of influence being exerted on it in its course, which means, crucially, it can be guided. It can be directed, shaped by political will throughout its duration. It's not just a runaway train.
So it's controllable, adaptable, and not just pure chaos that takes over everything. This means policy has a continuous hand on the reins throughout the entire conflict.
Exactly. The original motive which called it into existence should also continue the first and highest consideration in the conduct of it. Policy, it says, is interwoven with the whole action of war and must exercise a continuous influence. This continuous influence ensures that even amidst the fighting, the political purpose remains paramount. It's always shaping the strategic decisions, the tactical actions. War is always serving a larger political agenda, even if it's a brutal and destructive one.
That's such a powerful reframing, especially for those who might just see war as irrational chaos.
Yeah.
To use an analogy, maybe one that really brings this home for a beginner.
Yeah, analogies help.
Think of war as a specialized, really powerful tool in a government's toolbox. Policy is like the architect designing a house. They have the grand vision, the blueprint, the overall goals for the structure, whether it's a huge mansion or a tiny cottage.
Okay, I see where you're going.
War, in this analogy, is the hammer, a very powerful hammer, maybe even a sledgehammer. But the hammer doesn't decide what to build, right? It's merely a powerful instrument used by the architect to achieve their vision. Its use is guided by the overall plan, the blueprint. The hammer might be incredibly powerful, capable of immense destruction, but it doesn't dictate the entire design of the house or when and where it's used. It's always in service to the architect's policy.
That analogy perfectly captures the essence of war's subordination to policy and why it's never just random violence, however chaotic it looks.
Yeah.
Building on this foundational idea, the source then introduces another really profound concept, what it calls the wondrous trinity.
Ooh, wondrous trinity sounds grand.
It is. It describes three inherent tendencies, or maybe 3 points of attraction, deeply rooted in war's nature that any theory of war has to constantly balance.
3 points of attraction. That sounds intriguing, like opposing forces pulling things in different directions. What are they?
The first tendency concerns the people. This is the element of raw passion, of hatred and animosity, and the popular enthusiasm that can just break forth in war. The source states, the passions which break forth in war must already have a latent existence in the peoples.
So like the collective rage or the patriotic fervor of a nation, the emotional fire we talked about earlier.
Precisely, that emotional fuel. The source gives the vivid example of the French Revolution, where war suddenly became an affair of the people. It demonstrated unlimited means and energy far beyond what states before could muster. This wasn't just professional armies fighting, it was entire populations galvanized by intense feeling.
Okay, so popular passion is 1 point. What's the second point of attraction?
That's the general and his army, and it deals with the realm of probabilities and of chance. This is where the unpredictability and the skill or lack thereof of military action come into play. War is described as the province of chance, which increases uncertainty of every circumstance and frequently deranges the course of events.
What, the fog of war?
Exactly, the fog of war. This means military plans often need to be adapted on the fly, sometimes without all the necessary information, because the real world constantly throws curveballs. It's the realm of the unexpected, luck, skill, error, all that messy stuff.
So the human factor is skill, and the unpredictable element of luck or chance. This sounds like that constant battle between your perfect plan on paper and what actually happens on the ground.
That's exactly it. Then, the third tendency is where the political objects belong to the government alone. This is the rational, calculated purpose for which the war is waged. It's the cool, logical calculation of what the state aims to achieve through conflict, the very reason the war began, and its ongoing guidance. This ties directly back to our earlier discussion of war as an instrument of policy, right?
Right, the policy driver. So we have the raw emotion of the people, the unpredictable skill and chance involved with the army and its general, and the cold, rational calculation of the government. How do these three forces interact? And what's the, the so what for us, the listeners, in understanding this trinity?
Well, the source emphasizes that a sound theory of war must balance these three. You can't just focus on one. Ignoring any one of them or setting some kind of arbitrary, rigid relationship between them would immediately become involved in such a contradiction with the reality that the theory itself would be effectively destroyed, useless.
Okay. You need all three.
You need all three, and you need to understand their interplay. The problem is, theory shall keep itself poised between these three tendencies. They are constantly interacting, influencing each other, and shaping the reality of any conflict.
So what does that mean practically?
It means that any leader or negotiator or even just an informed citizen trying to understand a conflict must resist that urge to oversimplify. It's never just about one factor. It's always a dynamic interplay that you have to continuously weigh and try to understand. You can't just blame the generals or the politicians or the public mood alone. It's the mix.
This is a really sophisticated way to look at war. Definitely not just about one thing or one single driving force. To offer another analogy, maybe. Imagine a complex machine. perhaps a sophisticated vehicle.
Okay.
The people or the fuel, providing the raw energy and passion that drives it forward. The general and his army are the engine and the driver. They take that fuel and navigate the unpredictable terrain, using skill and adapting to chance encounters, obstacles.
Right.
And the government, with its political objectives, is the steering wheel and the destination it sets, the overall direction and purpose for the entire machine. All three have to work together in harmony, more or less. The machine won't go anywhere without fuel, it won't be steered properly without a driver who understands the engine and the road, and it won't reach its destination without a clear purpose and direction.
That's a perfect illustration of their continuous dynamic interplay. It really highlights why war is never, ever a simple, linear undertaking. It's always complex.
We've just seen how war is inherently political and shaped by this incredible trinity of forces, passion, chance, and purpose. But who is actually navigating this complex interplay? Who are the individuals tasked with steering this powerful, unpredictable machine? Let's now zoom in a bit from these grand theoretical ideas to the human element.
Good idea.
Because our source delves pretty deeply into the qualities required to command and persevere in war's complexities. It talks about military genius, and it makes it clear it's certainly more than just simple bravery.
Indeed. The text defines military genius not as one single quality, like courage alone. It's more like an harmonious association of powers in which one or other may predominate, but none must be in opposition. It's about a blend, a synergy of different mental, emotional, and intellectual strengths, all working together seamlessly for a unified purpose.
Like a well-tuned orchestra.
That's a great way to put it. All sections playing in concert, supporting each other.
So it's not necessarily about being the smartest person in the room, like having the highest IQ.
The source explicitly addresses this, actually. It notes that men who have little intelligence can never be resolute, which implies, a certain baseline of intellect is necessary just to comprehend the situation.
Sure, you need to understand what's going on.
Right. But it then clarifies that military genius is about a peculiar direction of the mind and not about great thinking powers in some abstract, purely intellectual sense. It's more about the mental fortitude to overcome the fear of wavering or doubting.
Decisiveness.
Exactly. Resolution, that crucial ability to make a decision and stick to it, even when faced with immense uncertainty and pressure. It's described as being preceded by an act of the mind making evident the necessity of venturing and thus influencing the will. It's about conquering that uncertainty with conviction, about committing your will when others hesitate or freeze.
This sounds a lot like what we see in any high-stakes leadership role, really, not just military. That brilliant conductor analogy again. They aren't just skilled at playing one instrument. They bring all the different sections of the orchestra together harmoniously, ensuring no instrument is playing against the others, guiding them towards a shared musical vision. Military genius sounds like that same kind of blending of different mental and emotional strengths for a single critical purpose.
A very apt comparison. It really highlights the blend of different faculties needed. The source also identifies 4 core elements that compose what it calls the atmosphere in which war moves: danger, physical efforts, uncertainty, and chance.
Okay, those sound like the ingredients for extreme stress.
Absolutely. These are the constantly opposing forces, the pressures that define the environment of war, and they require a great force of mind and understanding from those involved just to cope, let alone succeed.
Those sound like immense pressure points. What kind of force of mind are we talking about here? How do you contend with such a stressful atmosphere day in, day out?
The text lists various terms military writers use to describe this force: energy, firmness, staunchness, strength of mind, and character. And it ultimately views these as essentially one and the same power of volition, modified according to circumstances.
So willpower, grit.
Pretty much. It's the sheer will to act and persevere in the face of these immense pressures to keep moving forward, despite the fear, the exhaustion, the constant confusion. Interestingly, it also notes that the direct personal danger to the commander actually decreases with rank.
Really? That's fascinating and counterintuitive. I think the higher up you are, the more risk you're taking on.
And not personal physical risk, generally speaking. A commander-in-chief often faces almost nothing in terms of immediate personal danger compared to a frontline soldier, according to the text. But the mental and intellectual requirements skyrocket. The challenges faced by a commander-in-chief are described as among the most difficult which there is for the human mind.
Yeah.
At these higher ranks, boldness, which is still essential, absolutely must be accompanied by a reflective mind. It's no longer just about a blind outburst of passion because the stakes involve the fate of thousands, perhaps even a whole nation. It's about the good of the whole, which requires calculated daring, not just raw courage.
Does the source delve into what makes that reflective mind so rare or difficult to cultivate, especially in the heat of battle?
It certainly implies it's rare because it requires a mind that can remain calm and analytical amidst utter chaos, which is incredibly hard. And this is precisely where habit and experience become invaluable.
Ah, practice makes perfect, or at least better.
Something like that. Habit gives strength to the body in great exertion, to the mind in great danger, to the judgment against first impressions. The source uses this vivid image. The human eye in a dark room dilates its pupil, draws in the little light that there is, partially distinguishes objects by degrees, and at last knows them quite well. So, it is in war with the experienced soldier, whilst the novice is only met by pitch-dark night. Experience helps commanders distinguish objects, see patterns, make sense of the pitch-dark night of war, where a novice sees absolutely nothing but confusion and shadows.
That's a really powerful image of accumulated wisdom and skill. It also implies, then, that blindly copying great commanders might not work for everyone, right? Their genius isn't just a transferable formula you can cut and paste.
You're absolutely right. Great commanders often have very subjective individual styles. A large share of their individuality is contained in their methods. Blindly copying them can be really detrimental if it doesn't align with one's own individuality, their own strengths and weaknesses. Theory should facilitate study and understanding, yes, but not encourage mere imitation. Find your own way, informed by the principles.
That makes sense. Now, let's talk about something that the source says is even more crucial than physical strength or equipment or even numbers: moral forces.
Yes, this is huge.
It has a fantastic metaphor here, saying the physical are almost no more than the wooden handle, whilst the moral are the noble metal, the real bright polished weapon. That really emphasizes the immense, maybe often underestimated, importance of psychological factors in war.
It's a profound statement, isn't it? It suggests that even the finest army, equipped with the best weapons, can just crumble if its spirit is broken, its morale collapses.
So what are these moral forces specifically? What gives an army that noble metal quality?
Well, they are things like the military virtue of an army, which includes its discipline, its courage, its collective spirit, its resilience, its cohesion. It also encompasses individual boldness, confidence in the commander, affection towards the commander, even enthusiasm for the cause they're fighting for. These intangible factors are what truly give an army its cutting edge, enabling it to push beyond normal physical limits.
Though an army with high morale, even if it's physically inferior in some ways, can achieve incredible things.
Yeah.
That concept of moral forces, it reminds me of every time I've tried to build IKEA furniture. The instructions, the plan, it's always perfect on paper, right? But then reality hits, the friction hits, and you're missing a screw, or a piece doesn't quite fit. It's never as smooth as the blueprint suggests, and your own morale definitely takes a hit.
That's a great, very relatable example of friction in action.
So does the source offer any specific tips for minimizing that friction or strengthening these crucial moral forces? How do you keep the noble metal polished?
That's a good question. The source doesn't exactly offer a numbered tip list for minimizing friction, but it constantly stresses that strong moral forces, discipline, unity, belief in the cause, and the commander are essentially the antidote to friction.
They help you overcome it.
Exactly. They allow an army to persevere despite the inherent uncertainties and difficulties of war. The source notes that where military virtue is wanting, its place has to be supplied by something else, maybe great superiority of generalship or popular enthusiasm. Otherwise, the results will simply not commensurate with the exertions made. You won't get bang for your buck, so to speak.
You need that inner strength.
You do. History's full of examples. Think Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, whose astonishing successes were only possible because they commanded armies possessing this virtue, this incredible inner strength, this belief. Furthermore, the source points out that the moral effect of a victory increases in a progressive ratio, not just numerically.
What does that mean, progressive ratio?
It means a victory doesn't just reduce the enemy by the number of casualties inflicted. It profoundly elevates the conqueror's spirit and confidence, while simultaneously undermining the vanquished, breaking their will. This often leads to further physical losses because the enemy's will to resist is fundamentally broken. A rout, for instance, is when the moral force is so shaken that organized resistance becomes impossible, leading to a complete panicked flight, often with far more casualties than the initial fight caused.
That's a critical distinction. It's not just about the body count. It's about breaking the enemy's spirit, their belief in their own capabilities. It's about undermining their will to continue fighting, which goes back to that very first definition of war.
Precisely. It all ties together.
This profound understanding of human nature and morale, it must directly inform how commanders then choose to act on the battlefield, right?
Absolutely.
So let's shift now from the qualities of those who wage war to the more practical application of these insights, the strategic means and objectives they pursue to actually achieve their aims. What are the main goals in war, according to our source? Is it really about taking land, capturing cities, or is it something else?
The source makes a very clear and sometimes counterintuitive point, especially for beginners in strategy. The preservation of our own military power and the diminution or destruction of that of the enemy take precedence in importance over the occupation of territory.
Okay, wait, so destroying the enemy army is more important than taking their land?
Generally, yes. Territory possession only becomes the primary object if the enemy's military force hasn't been destroyed yet. Or perhaps if taking specific land directly achieves the overall political aim without needing further major fighting.
That's fascinating because most people, I think, probably assume capturing territory is the main thing. Planting your flag, that's the ultimate trophy of war. Why does destroying the enemy's military force come first?
Because if the enemy's army is truly destroyed, rendered incapable of organized resistance, the country and its security naturally follow. If their armed forces are neutralized, the territory becomes yours for the taking, essentially. Your will is then compelled because they can't resist anymore.
Oh, okay.
But if you only take territory while their main military force is still intact somewhere else, it can still pose a significant threat. It can regroup, it can counterattack, it can even operate against your lines of communication from afar, making your hold on the territory precarious. The text actually states that taking provinces before the enemy army had been defeated would always be looked upon only as a necessary evil.
A necessary evil.
Yeah. The destruction of the army is the real effectual action, the decisive blow. Taking provinces is typically a consequence, a kind of byproduct of that primary military success.
This makes perfect sense when you frame it like that. It's like that surgeon analogy again.
Yeah.
Their primary goal is to remove the disease, which is the enemy's military force. Removing the tumor means the patient recovers, which is like securing the territory.
Right.
But just bandaging the skin, just taking territory, while the disease, the enemy army, remains active underneath, that won't solve the core problem. It won't lead to a lasting peace or the successful imposition of your will.
Excellent analogy. It truly emphasizes that core strategic objective. Now, building on that, a very important question in military theory, one the source tackles head-on, is whether offense or defense is inherently stronger.
My gut tells me offense is stronger. You're taking the initiative, seizing momentum, dictating the action, right? Seems more powerful.
That's a really common intuition, absolutely. But the source argues, quite compellingly, for the opposite. The defensive is the stronger form of warfare.
Really? How so?
It defines defense as the warding off a blow, characterized by the state of expectancy or of waiting for this blow. However, and this is crucial, it immediately clarifies that this is not a passive state. It's an active posture, described as a shield formed of blows delivered with skill. So it's not about just sitting there waiting to be hit. It's about waiting for the opportune moment to counterpunch effectively.
Okay, so defense can be tactical, like defending a specific hill in a battle, or strategic, like defending an entire country.
Absolutely. The concept applies across all scales, from a single soldier's combat stance to a whole campaign or even an entire war. A battle is defensive if you wait for the enemy to appear in your chosen, prepared position. A campaign is defensive if you wait for the enemy to enter your theater of war. In all these cases, the waiting for element is key, but you're still delivering blows, just ideally at a time and place of your choosing, using the advantages of position.
And the defensive is actually the stronger form. That still feels a bit counterintuitive to me.
Yeah.
How does that work in practice? What gives it the edge?
It is counterintuitive, but the source explains it allows for that waiting for the enemy, and crucially, it allows you to leverage the advantages of ground, geography.
Terrain again.
Exactly. This gives the defender time to prepare fortifications, choose advantageous terrain that might funnel the attacker into predictable choke points, and conserve resources while forcing the attacker to expend theirs just to reach you. They often have to overcome prepared positions, sometimes fighting uphill, while their supply lines stretch thinner and thinner the deeper they advance. This isn't just philosophical, it's a profound strategic reality that leverages physics, geography, and logistics against the aggressor.
So it forces the attacker to overcome more obstacles.
Precisely. This is why generals, despite often having naturally offensive inclinations, frequently employ defense, especially when they have weaker forces or need to buy time. If defense is indeed the stronger form, it makes sense to use it when you are weak, to gain an advantage, to wear down the enemy. Then, once a victory is gained, perhaps through a successful counterattack and circumstances improve, it's both natural and necessary to switch to the offensive to achieve a positive object to actually go and compel the enemy's will, which defense alone usually cannot do.
Okay, so you start defensive to gain strength, wear down the opponent, create an opportunity. Then you transition to the offensive to achieve your ultimate goal. It reminds me of a martial artist again.
How so?
Adopting a defensive stance isn't passive. They're actively waiting for an opening, conserving energy, maybe using the opponent's momentum and mistakes against them. Once that opening appears, then they strike decisively. That's kind of the strategic defense in action, right?
Yeah. Exactly. It's about leveraging inherent advantages to set the stage for decisive success. Now, beyond just offense and defense, the source outlines several other key strategic principles and maneuvers. The most general principle of victory, it states flatly, is superiority of numbers.
More is better.
Well, yes, but it's nuanced. It isn't just about having more soldiers overall across the entire theater. It's about fixing the point where, the time when, and the numerical force with which the battle is to be fought. So it's about achieving numerical superiority at the decisive point in time, concentrating your forces where they matter most, even if you're outnumbered overall.
Okay, concentrating force. That makes perfect sense. More power at the point of contact generally means a better chance of winning that specific engagement. What about surprise? How important is that?
Surprise is called the medium to numerical superiority because it can effectively multiply your strength by catching the enemy completely off guard, unable to react effectively. But it's also a substantive principle in itself on account of its moral effect.
Back to morale.
Always. When surprise is successful, it causes confusion and broken courage in the enemy's ranks. It's about achieving an advantage not just through sheer numbers, but by striking where and when the enemy least expects it. This fundamentally impacts their morale and their ability to make sound decisions by creating fear, uncertainty, and disarray.
So surprise can help you achieve that crucial local numerical superiority, or it can act as a powerful moral weapon, potentially paralyzing the enemy before the fight even truly begins. And then there's stratagem, which sounds a bit sneaky.
Stratagem implies a concealed intention, maybe a sleight of hand with actions, but crucially, without a direct breach of one's word, like breaking a truce. It's about deceiving the enemy, leading them to commit the errors of understanding, which ultimately changes their perception of the situation and leads them to make critical mistakes. Think of it as wit or cleverness applied to actions rather than just ideas or words. It's a trick, a feint, a ruse designed to gain an advantage without resorting to outright lying or breaking faith.
Okay, clever deception. What about holding back forces? Is there such a thing as a strategic reserve that's different from just keeping some troops back in a battle?
Yes, the source acknowledges a distinct strategic reserve, but it clarifies its purpose is specifically for unforeseen events in strategy, not merely for prolonging combat during a single engagement, which would be a purely tactical reserve.
Why the distinction?
Because in strategy, unlike tactics, the crisis often stops after a success. A successful battle might end the immediate threat, meaning forces aren't always weakened in the same way and can potentially be used for entirely new enterprises like exploiting a breakthrough, reinforcing a different threatened sector, or dealing with an unexpected enemy move elsewhere. It's about flexibility on a larger scale.
Got it. And what are the typical offensive objectives once you've decided to go on the attack, assuming destroying the army isn't immediately possible or is part of a larger plan?
Well, the primary offensive objectives are often the conquest of territory, not just for the land itself, but crucially for gaining supplies, for levying contributions, which basically means taxing the conquered area to support your army, and for gaining credit, using the occupied territory as leverage in negotiations or as a bargaining chip. Or another major objective can be the capture of key fortresses, which control terrain or communication lines. These can become direct objects of the war if the overall political aim isn't necessarily to completely destroy the enemy's army, but perhaps just to gain leverage for favorable peace terms to negotiate from a position of strength.
Okay. And what about attacking from multiple directions at once? Like those pincer movements we often read about in military history. Are they a good idea?
That's known as a concentric attack advancing by converging lines. The source notes it offers potentially great results because, if successful, it can lead to cutting off the enemy, trapping them between your converging forces, which is often devastating. However,
There's a catch.
there's always a catch in war. Due to the inherent separation of the parts of the force and the enlargement of the theater of war, it also involves most risk. It's a definite high-reward, high-risk maneuver that demands incredibly precise coordination and timing between the separated forces. Frederick the Great's advance into Bohemia in 1757 is cited as an example. He divided his forces to threaten Austrian flanks and rear simultaneously, which led to a complete catastrophe for the Austrians at the Battle of Prague.
But the risk is clear.
Very clear. If your separated forces cannot link up as planned, or if one part is delayed or defeated before the junction, they can be destroyed individually, defeated in detail, by a concentrated enemy force. So it can be devastating for the enemy if it works, but you could also find yourself destroyed if you're not careful or if things go wrong.
That makes sense. Now, shifting gears slightly, but still on the practical side, the source really gets into the nitty-gritty of the reality of friction and logistics in war. It talks about armies being utterly dependent on sources from which it draws its subsistence and reinforcements, calling these lifelines the channels of life.
These channels are absolutely vital, literally the lifeblood of any sustained campaign. The text highlights the enormous burden of a traditional military transport train, the wagons, the animals, the personnel needed just to move supplies. Historically, these trains often effectively destroyed their own work due to their sheer size and inefficiency, consuming the very resources they were supposed to deliver.
Eating themselves almost.
Almost. It notes how more modern requisition systems, where troops are expected to live off the land and procure supplies locally as they advance, have greatly reduced this burden, making armies potentially much more mobile and less tied down by their own logistical tail.
So logistics isn't just some side issue for the quartermasters. It directly dictates strategy and how troops can even move.
Precisely. Supply considerations often literally trace out the strategic features of a campaign, dictating where and how armies can realistically move and operate. An army, the source warns, can simply melt away by degrees from want, meaning slowly weaken and dissolve due to lack of food, ammunition, replacements, even without fighting a single major battle if its supplies are cut off or insufficient.
Wow, melt away.
Yeah. The strategic rear, or the base of operations, is defined as this crucial strip of territory, connecting the army in the field back to its sources of supply and reinforcement, often protected by fortresses. The strength and security of this base dictates how far and how boldly an army can operate against enemy lines. A weak or threatened rear means your army is constantly looking over its shoulder, hesitant to advance too far.
That's a powerful image.
Hey,
An
Mark.
army literally melting away. It makes you think of an army's supply lines like the roots of a giant tree. You can cut the roots, sever that connection, and even a mighty tree, no matter how strong its trunk or branches appear, will eventually wither and die. The army simply cannot sustain itself without that constant connection to those vital resources flowing from its base.
That's a foundational truth of warfare, absolutely. And it's often overlooked when people focus solely on the grand battles or the brilliant maneuvers. Without a solid logistical base, even the most formidable army, led by the greatest genius, is incredibly vulnerable.
Let's talk about something incredibly fundamental to war that we often just take for granted. The ground itself, the actual landscape. The source emphasizes ground as a force multiplier. It says country and ground are permanent conditions of war, and they actively modify the action of all forces. It's clearly not just a passive backdrop for the fighting.
That's absolutely right. The geography isn't static in its effects. It's an active, dynamic player in any conflict. The form of the ground, like hills and valleys, natural features such as woods, marshes, and lakes, and even man-made changes like cultivated land or urban areas, all of these increase the influence of ground and fundamentally render war more complicated.
How so?
Well, they can make war more of an art, requiring clever adaptation and exploitation of the terrain. A general who truly understands the terrain, who can read the landscape, can gain a significant advantage, sometimes without even firing a shot, just by positioning their forces cleverly.
So the ground isn't just a static map you look at. It's an active player, maybe like the weather or the specific condition of the pitch in a football game. It affects how the teams can move, execute their plays, where they gain advantages or face disadvantages.
Exactly. A mountain range can funnel attacking forces into a predictable kill zone. A wide river can block them entirely. A dense forest can hide friendly troops for a surprise attack or severely restrict the movement of tanks and artillery. It's a dynamic element that constantly shapes the possibilities and constraints for both sides.
And this leads directly to thinking about defensive positions and fortifications, right?
Right. The text explains that entrenched positions, basically, dug-in, fortified areas prepared beforehand, can be a field of battle with added advantages for the defender. They multiply the defender's strength. Or, in some cases, they can even be a way to refuse battle entirely, allowing for an issue without a battle, where the enemy is simply deterred from attacking altogether because the position looks too strong to assault successfully.
Makes sense. And what about more permanent structures like fortresses? What's their core purpose according to the source?
Fortresses, fundamentally, are there to defend the state. Their role is strategic, not just tactical. The source delves into the strategic placement of these permanent defenses, discussing whether they should be solely on the frontier, guarding the borders, or distributed throughout the country.
What's the verdict? Borders or inland?
While many naturally belong on frontiers to defend borders directly, the source considers it a great mistake if the interior of the country was left entirely destitute of them, especially for larger states.
Why inland fortresses?
This is to account for what it calls reaction, essentially resistance from within the country, which can be crucial if the enemy manages to penetrate deep into your territory. These interior fortresses can serve as vital rallying points for defeated forces, secure supply depots, or places to tie down significant enemy forces who have to besiege them, slowing the enemy's advance and buying time for your main forces to recover or counterattack.
Defense in depth.
Exactly. The fortification of a capital city is also highlighted as a potential main point, if circumstances allow, as losing the capital often has huge political and moral consequences. For example, the source contrasts the potential value of Breslau, which, if properly fortified, would have maintained its strategic importance against various enemies, with Silberberg, another fortress whose importance diminished due to altered strategic circumstances and a less central location. Location matters.
So not just a single wall at the border, but ideally a layered defense throughout the country, a web of potential resistance points. But what about those really long defensive lines you sometimes read about in history, like a continuous trench or wall stretching for miles across a border? They always sound impressive.
They sound impressive, but the source is actually quite critical of them. It calls relying solely on extensive lines the worst kind of cordon war. It states they are of no value at all unless they are defended by a powerful fire throughout their length and are simply worthless in themselves if thinly held.
Why worthless?
Because an army's ability to furnish effective, concentrated fire is always limited. So defensive lines can only be relatively short if they are to be effectively defended at all points. If they're too long and stretched thin, they're easily overcome almost anywhere by a concentrated enemy attack without sufficient defense everywhere.
So a strong point is better than a weak line.
Generally, yes. For instance, the source contrasts the successful Dutch defense against superior French forces in 1672, which relied on capable supreme command and clever use of inundations and strongpoints, with their situation in 1787. Then, despite having strong terrain advantages, the lack of unity in command led to a rapid defeat. This highlights that even with strong geographic positions, the human element competent command, unity of effort is paramount. A thin, overstretched line is often just a broken line waiting to happen.
That's a powerful lesson that still seems very relevant today. Let's talk about some specific terrain features mentioned. What about mountains? How do they impact things?
Mountains, the text states, can give even small posts extraordinary strength. They provide formidable natural obstacles, strong support points for larger forces operating nearby, and potentially offer new defensive positions to fall back on if a retreat is necessary. They can act as significant strategic barriers that might force an enemy to divide their forces when advancing, making them vulnerable to concentrated attacks in the valleys or passes between the mountains. A small detachment that would be easily routed on flat, open ground can potentially hold its own against a much larger force in the mountains, precisely because the constricted terrain can negate the attacker's numerical advantage.
So mountains are inherently powerful defensive strongholds. What about rivers? How do they factor into strategy? Are they good defensive lines?
Rivers can serve as useful lines of defense, but there's a big condition. They need point d'appui, which essentially means strong anchor points like the sea, a neutral territory border, or some other significant impediment at their extremities.
Why anchor points?
To prevent the enemy from simply conducting turning movements, going around the end of your river line. Direct defense of a river without these strong flank supports is considered in the highest degree dangerous, as the enemy could just march upstream or downstream and cross where you aren't defending, getting behind you. Sure, a deep valley or marshy banks can increase the difficulty of passage at certain points, but these don't compensate for a lack of absolute flank security if the enemy can still find a way to turn the line somewhere else.
Okay, so rivers are tricky unless their ends are secure? And what about swamps or marshes? What's unique about them as an obstacle?
Swamps are described as often being extremely difficult to cross. This is mainly due to their generally impassable terrain off the few existing causeways and the lack of means to send initial detachments across easily, unlike a river where you might use boats to send small parties over first to establish a bridgehead. Building a solid causeway across a wide swamp is typically much slower and more resource-intensive than building a bridge over a river of similar width. And transporting heavy bridge-building materials across a wide swamp to where they're needed is exceptionally difficult. This often makes large swamps effectively insurmountable obstacles, creating unassailable flanks or barriers.
It's really incredible how much detailed thought goes into analyzing how these natural features dictate the possibilities and limitations of warfare, how they can be either a powerful shield or a deadly snare depending on how they're used or encountered.
Absolutely. Geography is never just scenery in war.
Okay, now let's wrap up our deep dive today by looking at how theory and history play into all of this complex picture, and also how war itself has evolved over time, because it certainly hasn't stayed the same. The Torus has a really important message about theory itself. It insists theory is observation, not dogma.
This is such a crucial distinction, and it can save us from many pitfalls when trying to understand any complex system, not just war. The purpose of theory, as the source states, does not necessarily require to be a direction for action. It's not primarily a how-to manual.
What is it then?
Instead, it's an analytical investigation that aims to lead to exact knowledge and thorough familiarity with experience, particularly drawing heavily on military history. Theory tries to explain why things happen, the underlying dynamics, the recurring principles, rather than just giving a rigid, step-by-step how-to guide for every situation.
So it's more like a guide to judgment, maybe, a way to structure your thinking rather than a rigid set of rules that you apply robotically. This sounds like a clear warning against overly simplistic, formulaic approaches.
Precisely. Theory's results are meant to be aids to judgment, tools to help you think critically, not inflexible rules that dictate every action. The source explicitly warns against criticizing deviations from theoretical principles without first understanding the underlying, often unique reasons why those deviations occurred in a specific context.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The source uses the example. If it's a generally accepted theoretical principle that cavalry should usually be deployed behind infantry for support, criticizing every instance where a commander deviates from this without investigating why that particular commander chose otherwise in that specific situation is unproductive and, frankly, foolish. Maybe the terrain or the enemy's disposition or a unique opportunity made the deviation logical. Theory helps illuminate the choices available and their likely consequences, but it doesn't and shouldn't dictate the choice itself. It's about empowering your understanding, not replacing your decision-making capacity.
That's a really refreshing take. It allows for flexibility, for adapting to unique circumstances, for genius even. It's like that meteorologist analogy again.
Yeah, I like that one.
Theory helps the meteorologist understand weather patterns. It explains why storms form, what conditions make them likely, their typical behavior. But it doesn't control the weather, nor is it a rigid script for how to deal with every single storm. It just makes you better equipped to understand and react intelligently to what's actually happening. This naturally leads to avoiding what the source calls the trap of one-sided systems.
A great analogy, yes. And the source cautions very strongly against what it calls the lame, totally inadmissible application of formal codes of laws or overly simplistic, arbitrary propositions when analyzing or criticizing military actions. Such rigid systems are easily shown to be one-sided, ignoring crucial factors, and they tend to lead to fruitless arguments without generating any real insight, because they try to impose simple, inflexible rules on an inherently complex, dynamic, and unpredictable reality. They oversimplify to the point of being misleading or useless.
And speaking of reality, how does history fit into this? It seems like history would be the ultimate teacher, right? Giving us all the answers to how war really works based on past events.
History is indeed a vital, indispensable source of instruction, absolutely. But it comes with significant limits and potential pitfalls. The source specifically warns that seeing events purely in the light of their eventual outcome can seriously bias our judgment. We tend to assume successful actions were inherently brilliant and failures were obviously foolish, often completely overlooking the immense uncertainty, the fog of war, that existed at the time the decisions were made.
Hindsight bias.
Exactly. Hindsight bias is a huge problem. More critically, the source points out that very often the real causes are not known in war, especially the moral ones or secret motives driving decisions. Events themselves are seldom fully known in all their detail. This makes it incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, to accurately trace effect back to cause, because so much crucial information, a commander's true intentions, the troops' actual morale, secret intelligence, pure chance, is simply unknowable or lost to the historical record.
That's a fascinating and actually quite humbling point. We always try to find these clear, linear reasons for historical outcomes, but you're saying we're often operating with seriously incomplete information, maybe even missing the most important factors.
Often, yes. The example given of Napoleon's disastrous Moscow campaign in 1812 illustrates this perfectly. His strategic defeat wasn't solely due to his actions on the battlefield or specific tactical blunders or even just the Russian winter, though all played a part. The source points out the profound impact of the uncertainty whether the Emperor Alexander would be intimidated into making peace simply by the capture of Moscow. Napoleon himself apparently believed capturing the capital would compel the Tsar to negotiate.
But it didn't.
It didn't. This last question, addressed to fate, as the source calls it, highlights the profound role of chance, political will, and factors entirely outside the military commander's control that often remain unknown or unquantifiable to historians later. Even if the campaign had gone perfectly for Napoleon from a purely military standpoint up to that point, the ultimate political decision by Tsar Alexander was uncertain. And that uncertainty, that refusal to yield, could lead to strategic defeat regardless of Napoleon's tactical brilliance.
So much is hidden behind the curtain of history. It really reminds us that war is a fundamentally human endeavor, full of contingency and unpredictability, not some predictable machine following set rules. Finally, let's talk briefly about the evolution of warfare. The source mentions several distinct historical periods, and it's clear war isn't static. It transforms over time.
It absolutely does. The source briefly touches on the shift from feudal armies, which generally had limited time commitments and relatively limited aims, to what it calls cabinet wars, fought by professional armies for calculated state objectives, and then the massive shift brought about by the French Revolution, which introduced unlimited means due to mass popular participation.
Can you quickly elaborate on those periods? Feudal first.
Sure. In the feudal period, armies were often temporary levies, like feudal lords bringing their knights and retainers for a limited campaign season, maybe 40 days. Their aims were often punitive raids, settling scores, or localized conquests, generally not total subjugation or destruction of another realm. Logistics were extremely rudimentary, so armies couldn't operate far from their own territories for very long. War was intermittent and relatively small scale compared to later periods.
Okay, and then cabinet wars. What were those like?
These emerged more prominently with the rise of professional standing armies, funded by the state, in the 17th and 18th centuries. These wars were often fought with more prudence and calculation by professional soldiers serving the cabinet or the government of the monarch. Objectives were typically limited, maybe gaining a specific province for negotiation leverage, or capturing strategically important fortresses rather than the total destruction of the enemy state or its army. The aim was often to gain a distinct advantage for diplomatic bargaining, not necessarily to shatter an entire nation's will. These wars were less about passionate national conflict and more about calculated statecraft using military means.
And then the French Revolution just blew that model up.
Fundamentally, the source emphasizes war had suddenly become again an affair of the people, and that of a people numbering 30 millions, every one of whom regarded himself as a citizen of the state. This was a revolutionary shift towards mass conscription, the levy en masse, and national mobilization. This altered policy, produced by the French Revolution, brought war, in the source's terms, nearer to its absolute form.
Meaning more intense.
Exactly. It could be waged with far greater energy, drawing on vastly larger resources, and fueled by a national commitment and passion than ever before. It was no longer just the government or a relatively small professional army fighting. It was potentially the entire nation participating, directly or indirectly fueling the conflict with immense passion and manpower. This dramatically increased the scale, intensity, and often the brutality of warfare.
And this change ushered in the character of modern war, with its potential for massive armies and potentially total nation-braiding objectives.
Indeed. The source points to the experience of the Napoleonic Wars, particularly Spain, with its widespread insurgent measures and popular guerrilla resistance against Napoleon. Russia in 1812, which demonstrated that an empire of great dimensions is not to be conquered if its defensive strength lies in depth and its people are determined to resist. And Prussia in 1813, which showed the power of a citizen militia, Landwehr, when motivated. All these revealed what an enormous factor the heart and sentiments of a nation may be in determining military strength and outcomes.
The people factor again.
The people factor writ large. These events, according to the source, changed the character of modern war, demonstrating conclusively that moral forces and national spirit could turn the tide, even against seemingly overwhelming physical force and numerical superiority. They showed the incredible power of the people unleashed, adding a new, potent, and often much harder to control dimension to warfare that continues to shape conflict today.
And that feels like a fitting place to leave our deep dive for today. #tag outro. Wow, what an incredible journey we've taken deep into the very fabric of conflict, guided by some truly timeless and really thought-provoking insights. Let's quickly recap some of the essential nuggets of knowledge, the main takeaways we've uncovered today.
Yeah, let's boil down.
First, maybe most fundamentally, we learned that war is essentially a political act. It's a tool, an instrument used to achieve policy goals, not some independent, chaotic force that just runs wild on its own.
Second, it's constantly, inescapably shaped by what the source calls friction. All those unpredictable elements of reality, chance, human error, logistical hiccups that defy perfect planning and add immense difficulty and uncertainty to every single action in war. Nothing ever goes exactly to plan.
Third, the human element. Things like passion, military genius, that blend of qualities, and especially those moral forces, are just as crucial as, if not sometimes more crucial than, physical strength or numbers. They are the noble metal of the weapon, the true cutting edge that determines resilience and success.
Fourth, strategy involves that careful dance between destroying the enemy's military force and securing territory, recognizing that neutralizing their military power is usually paramount. It also demands a constant balancing act between offense and defense, understanding that defense, counterintuitively, is often the stronger form of warfare, at least initially, if employed skillfully.
Fifth, geography plays a surprisingly active and dynamic role. The ground isn't just a stage. It influences every decision, every tactical possibility, shaping how forces move, fight, and interact. You have to master the terrain.
And finally, we discussed how theory itself is best understood as a guide to judgment, not a rigid rulebook. Its purpose is analytical investigation to aid understanding, urging us to grasp the underlying nature of war rather than blindly follow abstract doctrines. It's about thinking critically, not just following orders.
These ideas, while they're rooted in the strategic theory of war, they really offer powerful lenses for understanding conflict and decision-making in pretty much any complex system you encounter, wouldn't you say? Whether it's in business or politics, or maybe even navigating personal challenges.
Absolutely. They teach us that perfect plans rarely survive first contact with reality, and that understanding the hidden dynamics is key.
So, as you go about your week, here's something to maybe mull over, a reflective question for you. How might understanding the pervasive nature of friction in real-world events, those unexpected problems and obstacles, or recognizing the immense power of moral forces at play, think motivation, belief, confidence, how might that change your approach to a challenge you're currently facing? Perhaps one where a perfectly logical plan seems to be hitting unexpected walls or running into unforeseen resistance.
It's a great question to ponder. How do you account for the unpredictable and the human element in your own plans?
Think about that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.